If you knew you were enough, what would your life look like? What would love look like? This is the Enough Factor broadcast, where we're redefining what makes you enough in life and in love. Now here's your host, Suzette. In this year of our Lord 2020, I've had to become comfortable with being uncomfortable, okay with not being okay. It's brought everything that I had grown accustomed to into question. My silence. Troubled by the events of the last few months, the pandemic, the suffering economy, and the brutality against Black, Indigenous, and people of color, I had to dig deeper for answers. That took me to a familiar passage I grew up hearing. For everything there is a season, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow. And while it continues, I want to stop where it says a time to keep silence and a time to speak. It was time to speak. It took watching the newsreel of George Floyd's death that called into question my silence. It shook me, y'all. And I looked at the long line of deaths of Black and brown men and women that I could no longer treat as isolated incidences. But I had to admit there was a real problem, a cancer threatening the lives of a people and the soul of this country. What I saw in me brought me to my knees, for I saw the ways I had aided and abetted it all by being silent. The silence of people pleasing. Although I had made great strides to overcome people pleasing, I saw there was still work to do. We've all been socialized to abide by someone else's rules and judge ourselves based on how well we live up to someone else's definition. Every time I tuck my true self away, my culture, my pride in the skin I'm in, I was consenting to silence. The silence of it's their problem. Another form of silence. From a broader standpoint, I had to admit that I was part of a collective silence that emboldened the irreverent way a man's life ended. I had to admit that I, like so many, had been lulled into silence, a silence that said, as long as me and mine are okay, it's their problem, not mine. A silence that said, well, that's an isolated incident. Otherwise, things are better overall. All that got called into question as I realized that the reason a broken system could continue to be broken was because, as a collective, we allowed it. We allowed it by not holding our lawmakers, our authorities, our leaders accountable. So there's the silence of it's their problem. Then there is the silence of not speaking up. I realized that by not speaking up, I was being silent. I had no voice. You see, your voice is what gets the attention of those around you. Its utterance dignifies your presence, your existence. By being silent, I was allowing folks to ignore me, to ignore my being a part of the struggle. I was walking around with a knee on my neck. I could not breathe. There was no dignity to my value. Having said this, how many of you are suffering in silence? How many aren't getting your needs met because of silence? How many questions are going unanswered because of your silence? Think about how many times you've tried to figure out, for instance, why a man did what he did, or what he meant by what he did or what he said. Why didn't you just ask him? Seems pretty simple, right? But rather than ask him, we tend to try to reason it out by ourselves, bouncing back and forth between whatever possibility seems the most plausible. Then we ask our friends who join in the futility of trying to figure it out and oftentimes offering you more to think about. Then, when you have the chance to actually ask him, you are so full of whatever story you decided was right that instead of actually asking, you ask, but then you clarify based on what you dreamed up, which basically becomes an accusation. That, my sisters, that is self-imposed silence. Silence because you talk around the issue but never reveal yourself. Silence because now you've made that person so uncomfortable that even if he tries to give you his answer, you're convinced that your answer is the real answer. So you're being complicit in his silence by not opening up a space for his voice to be heard. Why are we silent? We weren't born silent. We were born crying bloody murder, crying as a declaration that I'm here, deal with it. So if we were born that way, then somebody had to teach us to be silent. They taught us to only speak when we're spoken to. They taught us to be seen and not heard. They taught us that asking certain questions was not okay. I don't know about you, but I got shamed, I got blamed, I got guilted because of it. And it flows into our relationships with other people, especially our relationships with men. We're silent because we don't want to piss them off. We're silent because we don't want to come across as insecure. We're silent because we were born into a world where we were taught to be silent. That his opinion was better, what he thought was more important than actually sharing who we are. I've come to a place where I can no longer be silent. And I believe that the urgency of this moment is calling on all of us to stop being silent. I realize that silence teaches people to ignore you. to stop seeing you. And I used to get upset about that. I used to get upset when someone accused me falsely. Don't you even know me? Was what I thought. How can you not know me? But then I started seeing ways that I reinforced it by what I tolerated. I thought about the times we talked at things, or I allowed them to dominate the conversation, but I didn't reveal myself fully. I tolerated things that made them feel it was okay to think what they thought, to say what they said. And when I got to the point where I could no longer tolerate it, the real me spilled out all over everything, often leaving them feeling uncomfortable because of the intensity being disproportionate to what they shared. Maybe that's not your experience. Maybe you are the person who has told folks over and over again who you are. And maybe you feel that you have to explain yourself all the time and you're sick of it. What life has taught me when that happens is how oftentimes people are so full of what's on their minds. They're so full of their fantasy, their ideal, their job description they've hired you to fulfill, that they cannot hear you. In both examples, you feel isolated, don't you? Both examples leave you feeling lonely. Both examples erase you. I saw how my silence allowed folks to look right past me, look right through me. But when I started speaking up, things started to change. Something as simple as being asked, "How are you today?" or "How are you doing?" and actually answering honestly changed things. I noticed that people stopped. They stopped, they paused, and instead of looking through me, they actually paid attention. It forced them to have to look at me, to have to actually acknowledge me. After George Floyd's death, I made a commitment to be silent no more. This meant speaking my truth even when it was hard, admitting to my feelings, allowing myself to feel vulnerable, and showing up authentically. Instead of making someone else's experience of me my focus, I made speaking up my focus. I realized it was the kindest and most loving thing I could do. Last but not least is a silence that I also see a lot in high achieving women. It's the silence of being uncomfortable with praise. I've watched and listened as many times people start looking kind of that glazed look when folks started laying the praise on thick, as if you're saying, "Okay, that's enough now. Let's move on to something else." That's a form of silence, self-silence. Or even if you mention a win, it's like you try hard not to belabor it, not to say too much about it, lest you should sound full of yourself and people thinking that you're bragging or you think you're all that. But false humility is a form of silence. Not sharing wins is silence. Acting like a win or an achievement is not important is silence. changing the subject when people commend you, celebrate you, talk about how much you have blessed their lives, is silence. As we celebrate July with phenomenal next level women, I want you to make a commitment to stop being silent, to stop being the best kept secret. I want you to celebrate your wins. I want you to speak your truth. I want you to show up honestly in your relationships, especially your relationships with men. And if you have performed for people for so long that you don't know what your voice sounds like, what authentic looks like for you, or you've been silent for so long in your relationships until you don't know how to be you, then reach out. I'm here, and I have it on good authority that I'm great at amplifying your voice, your value, and your vision, so you can be silent no more and experience love and life in a brand new way. You have just listened to the Enough Factor podcast with your host, Suzette. To get notified of new episodes or to dig deeper into today's topic, become a subscriber. And while you're at it, tell us how we're doing and what topics you're interested in. We appreciate your feedback and your reviews. Until next time, remember, you are worthy, you are worth it, you are enough.